It's Tuesday, February 27th. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm in Providence, Rhode Island with Dr. Adam Myers, Associate Professor of Political Science here at Providence College. Go Friars. Originally from the greater central Illinois area, he earned his PhD in political science from the University of Texas at Austin. He is an expert in the areas of state politics, federalism, and political parties and elections. His work has appeared in leading journals including PS, Political Science and Politics, Studies in American Political Development, Social Science Quarterly, and the American Review of Politics. He is frequently called on as an expert analyst on state and local politics in Rhode Island and Massachusetts media outlets. But we're here today to discuss his work and his research in the area of Southern politics. So thank you, Dr. Myers, Adam, for having me here in Providence. My first time in Rhode Island.
Yeah, welcome to the Ocean State. I'm really happy to be a part of this.
It's unusual for two Illinois guys to sit down and discuss Southern politics, much less in Rhode Island. So with that, tell me about growing up in Springfield, up in Sangamon County.
That's right. Yeah. So I grew up in a state capital, and Springfield obviously is far away from where the vast bulk of Illinoisans live. Mm-hmm. So we always felt, very proud of our, in our view, rightful title as, the center of the state or the state capital. Mm-hmm. And even though my parents weren't involved in politics, I always knew that I could see, the dome of the State House from not far away from where I lived, and so I always had a sense of its importance. And a lot of my friends growing up had parents who worked in state government, mm-hmm. So I think from a very early age I was quite interested in politics, and I guess, on top of that, I would stay up all night watching election returns from a very young age. So I always knew that... You
were one of those cool guys like me.
Yeah. Exactly. One of those cool guys like you who, earned his popularity off his interest in politics and history.
Now, do you remember... when Dick Durbin was the congressman, I guess, from your area.
He was the congressman from my area until 1996 when he was elected to the Senate. And my family knew him. My grandparents knew him very well. My grandmother had a jewelry store, more like an art store, in downtown Springfield. And he and his wife were frequenters of that store.
So yeah, 1996, that was when he succeeded the sort of political giant, even though he was a tiny man, Paul Simon from my neck of the woods.
That's right,
Makanda, Illinois. So yeah, that was an early election that I remember following closely as a 10-year-old growing up in Southern Illinois. So for those who don't know, and this is an aside, what is a horseshoe, and why do you never order a pony shoe?
Right. Well, a horseshoe is this Springfield's delicacy that we're very proud of, even though I think it's absolutely disgusting. It's basically... We
can say that. We're a safe distance now.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's basically like a steak sandwich with French fries and some gooey cheese sauce on top of it. Apparently the best place in Springfield to get one, at least I haven't had a horseshoe in years and years and years. But I've been told that at this point the best place to get one is Darcy's Pint on Stanford Avenue. But yeah, most Springfield restaurants, long-standing establishments, serve a horseshoe. And to be honest, I am not exactly sure what a pony shoe is.
A pony shoe is the smaller version.
Okay.
And for basically, if you order a pony shoe, and this used to be obviously in the 90s and early 2000s, it would basically give license to everybody to display toxic levels of masculinity and question, yeah,
I see.
your you know
Okay.
your manhood if you weren't able to wolf down an entire horseshoe with
Okay.
the cheese product.
Right. So, I grew up in kind of a family. Well, at least my dad is kind of a '60s hippie type who's been a vegetarian since the early '70s. So we always observed horseshoes from a distance.
There you go.
We never partook in that Springfield tradition.
A Gertzian cultural study.
That's right.
So if your folks weren't in politics or involved in state government, what did they do in Springfield?
So my dad was a psychologist. He
Okay.
worked at the State Mental Health Center. It was called McFarland at the time. And my mother was a special education teacher in a middle school in Springfield, actually the middle school that I went to.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, you talked about how you would stay up and watch politics. Did you ever get involved in campaigns? Were you a leafleter or a
Yeah, but
parade marcher?
Yes, but not until later.
Okay.
So I dabbled in some political campaign work after college. And I was never very good at it. It's actually one of the reasons I decided to go to graduate school is because I realized, real political work was not for me. Knocking on doors, making phone calls, and so on and so forth.
The phone banks are just...
Right. You have to really feel strongly about a candidate in order to endure all of that. And I was just never, I think from early on I realized a better role for me is as kind of a neutral observer. I'm somebody who from a very young age sort of saw myself as a contrarian,
Okay.
Whatever the kind of the dominant political view was in whatever, environment I was in, I was always opposed to it. So
The walking Socratic method over
that's right.
here.
That's right. And so, yeah, I couldn't. I tried as I did. I could never fully immerse myself in campaign work because that requires really kind of, accepting the message of
Sure.
the campaign that you're working for, and sort of accepting the views of the candidate that you're working for and all of his staff and so on. And I couldn't do it. And so I realized that if I want to be involved in politics somehow, while not picking a side, the best role for me was as a political science professor, and that's how I wound up in graduate school.
So where'd you go for your undergrad, and what did you study there?
Yeah, so I bounced around.
This will be good.
Yeah. Bounced around a lot in my life. I went to college in Southern California in a small liberal arts school called Pomona College outside Los Angeles. While there, I actually majored in geology. That was probably a mistake on my part. I always knew my true interests were in political science and history and in social sciences more broadly, but when I arrived at Pomona, I decided I wanted to kind of expand my horizons, and I thought, geology sounds pretty cool. It may allow me to live out or work outdoors, and so I majored in geology. I did minor in political science.
So you actually got the major?
Yeah.
In okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I was no good in geology. I was not, I just didn't have any talent as a geologist, and so I by my senior year, I realized that a career in geology was not really going to be in the cards for me. So after college, I bounced around a lot. I spent a year in Kentucky working or volunteering in an AmeriCorps position, and then I had a stint in D.C. where I once again tried to break into politics. Oh, and I had a stint working on a campaign or two, and then I decided, the academic life is for me, so I applied to graduate schools. And I think in part because I was a geology major. Political science graduate programs were not so interested in me, but I did get accepted to one place, which was the University of Texas at Austin.
Which is no sniff.
Yeah.
That's a good program.
Yeah. I was very happy, and so I moved to Austin.
Okay. So tell me, you're applying, so you have to have some sense of a project, even if none of us actually do that when we get there. What was your pitch to the admissions committee, that what you brought to the table and what you were going to hopefully produce while you were there?
Yeah, totally. So from what I recall, my statement of purpose,
that's what they were called.
Yeah, in my graduate school applications really emphasized my interest in political geography, which at the time was not a big, it's not a subfield of political science today, but today there's like a sort of a cottage industry or a small community of political geography scholars within political science. And I think that's in large part because it's just become so clear to political scientists and Americans the big role that geography plays in our political system. But in 2005, 2006, when I was applying to graduate school, this was only a few years removed from the 2000 presidential election where the red-blue map first appeared. People weren't really thinking about geography very much. The dominant view was that geography and region and place used to matter, but with the rise of modern technology and ease of travel and so forth, it no longer did. But I am somebody who, my interests in politics have always been geographical. From a very young age, I loved looking at political maps, and I have all these political maps here in my wall. I would look at atlases of presidential elections from a very young age. Long before the red and blue pattern emerged, I loved looking at maps of different states and trying to figure out what the geographic patterns in election results actually meant. And so I wrote a statement of purpose to graduate school, really emphasizing my interest in understanding this kind of emerging political geography. I think I referenced the 2000 presidential election, the changing demographic patterns, the growing importance of the suburbs to the Democratic coalition. So I think I was very influenced in particular by Jim Gimple's work. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he was one of the first political scientists that was really kind of clued into this. He wrote a book called Separate Destinations in the late 90s that really emphasized the role of domestic in-migration and foreign immigration in changing the politics of states. And then he wrote another book with a graduate student of his called Patchwork Nation, which kind of sought to look inside states and kind of understand their internal political divisions better geographically. And so I sort of pitched that as my interest in graduate school. And I was very lucky because there was one person on the admissions committee for the Department of Government of the University of Texas in 2006 who was really interested in my statement of purpose. And I think from what I understand, he convinced the admissions committee to let me in. So that's how I got in.
Did that person become your major professor?
He was on my committee.
Okay.
But he ended up leaving for the University of Minnesota. His name is Andy Karch. But we remain very close. He's always been a supporter of mine. So yeah.
So it sounds like political geography is what we would call in the historical community almost community studies. Because it focuses on those subdivisions. And somebody like me who is a details guy that gets overwhelmed by details. My master's thesis had to be a county level study.
Yeah.
The dissertation had to be a state level study.
Yeah.
I can't be trusted with anything above state level because it'll never get written, or it'll be 2,000 pages long.
Yeah.
So how then did you turn that interest in the political geography into your program of study, and into what eventually became your dissertation?
Yeah. So there's a lot of interesting strands here. So actually,
Yep.
going all the way back to my time in college, right, at Pomona, like I said, I was a geology major, but I was a political science minor, and I did take a lot of courses in history as well while I was there. So I started thinking about a lot of the issues that eventually sort of formed my research agenda as a graduate student, as an undergrad. And my interest in political geography sort of overlapped closely with an interest in a larger interest in partisan change.
Mm-hmm.
Right? I was fascinated by realignment theory, which of course
Right.
by the time I got to graduate school, realignment theory had completely fallen out of favor with political scientists, as I'm sure you know. This the whole idea of
Sundquist,
Petrosic,
Petrosic,
so that's right. And so Walter Dean Burnham, who is another one of the big founders of realignment theory, he taught at the University of Texas. He was already emeritus by the time I was there, but I got to know him a little bit, and we had some discussions about it. And I could wax on for a long time about realignment theory. But I will just say this: the idea that American history can be divided into sort of discrete partisan eras, where one party is the dominant party and the other party is the minority party, where there's kind of a central axis of cleavage dividing the parties, related to fundamental differences in governing philosophy. That always fascinated me. And the idea that you could literally map that onto changing electoral patterns, right? Electoral patterns that you could see on a map, that always fascinated me. And so from the very beginning of my time in graduate school, I started thinking about kind of America's political geography within the context of realignment theory, within the context of partisan change. I was interested in mapping partisan change, and I was interested in, more than that, understanding its political implications.
Sure.
So I ended up writing a dissertation about partisan conflict in state legislatures.
Okay.
And what I did in my dissertation was I ran a form of cluster analysis on state legislative districts, classifying them into different categories based on the interactions among their demographic characteristics, right? So so I think I came up with, or the cluster analysis, and technically it was latent class analysis, but whatever, I won't get into the methodological differences. It came up with 9 categories of state legislative districts. So some of the categories were deep rural, small city and country, urban ethnic districts, trying to think of some of the others, inner suburbs, outer suburbs. There was a kind of a distinct cluster that emerged in my analysis called yuppie districts, sort of well-educated districts with lots of college graduates, lots of professional workers. Anyway, so like
The research triangle.
the
in
research
North Carolina.
triangle, right? Most big college towns
Yeah.
would fall into that. Like I'm sure you know probably the district that you live in Athens is a yuppie district.
The blue dot.
The blue dot, yeah. And so these nine categories of state legislative districts, I kind of tracked their the composition of state legislative, like of those districts across state legislative chambers in about, I think it was about 25 states that formed my analysis, and then I tracked partisan representation across them, right? And I one of my principal findings was that in both northern and southern states, the percentage of deep rural and small city and country districts, as I called them, represented by Democrats had gone down dramatically over the course of the time period I was looking at, which was like 1992 to 2012.
Yeah.
And
Definitely.
And so then I looked at the impact of those kinds of changes in partisan representation of these different types of districts on legislative outcomes, right? And I showed in my dissertation that the changing patterns of partisan representation across these different types of districts played a big role in contributing to polarization in state legislatures, right? Because kind of more moderate Democrats representing rural districts were replaced by far more conservative Republicans, again, in both northern and southern states across this time period. But, of course, the trends were a lot sharper in southern states.
Sure.
And so that kind of got me started on my research agenda in southern politics.
Okay. So you're seeing this in your dissertation research, and we'll talk about this, jumping ahead, the same sort of things with the inner suburbs and its shift towards, Democrats as opposed to being the workhorse for Republicans. We'll talk about that in a bit. But tell me what it was about the South that made you say, this is interesting. I want to pursue this, and I may have something new to say.
Right. Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think there were several things. One is I went to graduate school in Texas, right, which primed me to think about the South.
Sure.
Another is that I was interested in partisan change, as I said earlier. And if you're interested in partisan change and in the idea of realignment more broadly, there's no region of the country that evinces or that exhibits partisan change, or that has exhibited it as strongly as the South, right? I mean, you can make a case, I guess, that partisan change in New England, where we are.
Yeah,
right
Vermont
now,
used to be quite Republican.
Yes, exactly. So you can make the case that New England is kind of like a mirror image of the South in terms of the partisan change that it's experienced. But I think it's fair to say that partisan change in the South is really kind of at the core of so much in modern American politics, so much of the transformation of American politics between, let's say, the 1950s and the 1960s and today. Both the good and, in many respects, the bad can ultimately be attributed to the Southern realignment. And so, by the time I was in graduate school, the Southern realignment was already a well-trodden ground. Many books that had been written about it, and so on and so forth. So while I was in graduate school, I knew I didn't want to just explore that, even though it interested me, just because I felt like there was a consensus about how it happened, even if there was sort of disagreement on the margins and so on. So like just writing another book about the Southern realignment, that didn't interest me. But I was, from the beginning, very interested in state politics. Again, I pitched myself in my statement of purpose for graduate school as a state politics scholar. And the more I learned about Southern politics, the more I realized that, or the more I learned about state politics, I should say, the more I realized that the standard story of the Southern realignment, the extant literature on the Southern realignment in political science was incomplete. It focused overwhelmingly on changing voting patterns in federal elections.
Right.
And the story of the Southern realignment in state level elections and state legislative elections in particular was actually still unfolding when I was in graduate school, right? It was by no means complete. I mean, 2010 was a watershed election. The Alabama legislature and the Arkansas legislature, hadn't fallen into Republican control until, post 2010.
That's true. That's right, but it still feels wrong. Even though you and I,
Yeah.
and I know that's
Yeah.
the case. It just doesn't feel right. Oklahoma.
Yeah,
It was
Oklahoma is another example.
Another one too.
So, and I really actually started getting into this work when I was here. I came to Providence College in 2014, and at that point, I'd been messing around with my dissertation, and I realized for various reasons that we could get into, but that maybe we shouldn't, because it would take us off on a tangent.
I don't want to. It may be triggering. I don't know.
Well, I'll just say this. I kind of decided to set my dissertation work aside. I realized that
One sympathizes.
Yeah, turning my dissertation into a book was going to be more trouble than it was worth. But I had collected all of this data on state legislative races and in particular partisan presidential voting by state legislative district going back to the 1980s for the purpose of writing my dissertation. And I was like, what can I do with this data? And then I realized, why not use this data to answer this important question that Southern politics scholars, in my view, had not really sufficiently answered, which is, how did the Southern realignment eventually make its way to the state level, right? There had been books written in the 90s by folks like Astrup and Lublin. I guess Lublin was a little later, 2004, kind of arguing that the Southern realignment was a top-down realignment, that it started off at the federal level and eventually made its way to the state level. But those books were mostly written while the process was actually still occurring.
That's right.
Right? And I felt like, this was circa 2014, 2015, I felt at that point like I could write some articles that would really sort of explain the process more fully, because I'd be able to do so with new data that could explain, how the process had actually sort of made its way to its ultimate conclusion. And in particular, I thought there were a couple of things that the extant research didn't address. One of them was, what explained the fact that throughout the 1980s and 1990s, as most southern states were already overwhelmingly voting for Republican candidates in presidential elections, at that very same time, their state legislatures continued, for the most part, to be dominated by Democrats. Again, with a few exceptions, North Carolina, Florida, right? If you think about it just sort of objectively, empirically, analytically, there can only be two basic explanations for that. One is that people are voting differently for federal elections than for state elections, right? That's something that, again, borrowing from Jim Gimple at the University of Maryland, who was an early inspiration for my work, I called electoral incongruence, but you could also just call it split ticket voting, right? That's one explanation. The other explanation is that Republicans just weren't fielding candidates in parts of southern states where their presidential candidates and later their congressional candidates were winning, right? That's the non-contestation explanation, right? And so, at a very basic analytical level, right, the failure of Republicans to win control of southern state legislatures while their federal candidates were winning the states, southern states, can only be attributed to one of those two factors. So I ended up writing two different papers on both those topics. One of them, the one focused on electoral incongruence or split ticket voting, was published in the American Review of Politics. The other one on uncontested seats in southern state legislative elections was published in Social Science Quarterly. And I could talk about those papers.
Please.
Yeah, so the paper for the American Review of Politics made the argument that, as I recall, anyway, it's been a little while since I wrote that paper, that basically the where Republicans did field candidates in a lot of southern state legislative races, they failed to win them largely because Democratic incumbents and again I'm talking specifically about rural southern majority white parts of the South, right? The importance of incumbency advantage in those districts was vast, and that Democrats maintained their dominance in many southern state legislatures largely because voters did split their tickets between, let's say, Republican presidential or U.S. Senate candidates and Democratic state legislative candidates, largely when these kind of long-standing Democratic incumbents who had been around since the 60s and 70s were running for re-election. But that when these old guys started to retire in, circa, let's say, 2002, 2004, 2006, Republicans made major headway. But then that even among the old timers, the kind of the old school moderate Democrats in a lot of southern state legislatures, the bottom fell out in 2010, right? The results of my analyses consistently showed that a lot of folks who had won their re-elections every single year going back to the 1970s and 1980s, whether they had a challenger or not in the general election, they just failed to do it in 2010.
What was, and you may have been getting ready to say this, but what was it about 2010? Obviously, this is the Tea Party revolution, the backlash to President Obama's first term. What was it about that election and those issues that penetrated down to the state legislative level where, say, a 1994 Gingrich revolution didn't?
Right. I think it must have been and I'm not entirely sure, but I think it was a combination of factors. One is I think the Republican institutional infrastructure at the local level was much, much more advanced in 2010 than it was in 94. The other is that I think there was kind of a generational replacement among rural southern white voters, right? The silent generation and elder baby boomer voters were and saw themselves as Democrats, right? Who, they were Democrats ancestrally, they'd remain Democrats, and they could vote Republican in national races, but when you get down to the state and local level, the ancestral Democratic identification sort of outweighed the national considerations. But I think for younger cohorts of rural southern whites, that was no longer the case. And it was difficult for me. I mean, I thought about different ways of actually demonstrating this empirically. It's hard to do because there's no survey data that asks about vote choice at different levels, right? So I wasn't able to ever test that empirically, but I think this is something that I suggested in that article, that just younger cohorts of rural southern whites they were not as inclined to split their tickets, in large part because that ancestral Democratic Party identification by like the late aughts was largely gone among them. And then I just think, more broadly speaking, and I think this is true not just in the South but nationwide, right? The nationalization of politics means that voters in general across age brackets are less likely to be able to distinguish between state and local candidates and national candidates. The vast bulk of us now get our news from national sources, not from local newspapers and so on. And so, all of these factors combined make it so that this kind of incongruence that really used to define Southern politics, I think is largely gone. And that, of course, relates to the other article I wrote about uncontested seats. And this, this is a really interesting topic for me. I've written a number of papers about uncontested seats in state legislative elections, including one that has to do with Rhode Island, because Rhode Island actually, in a lot of respects, resembles the South it's in all sorts of ways.
I was going to ask you about the Rhode Island 2nd Congressional District and how we're seeing these sort of trends.
Yeah.
As you were saying, more broadly, Maine 2nd District.
Yeah.
The erosion of ancestral Democratic areas in Southern Illinois, for example. Yeah.
So there's a lot
post 2010, post Trump,
right?
Post 2016. So
so there's a lot there, and we can, if you want, go through each of those.
That's right.
But I'll say this about it's a very interesting thing. The phenomenon of uncontested seats is far larger in state legislative races than in congressional races. Right? And so this makes state legislative elections really quite different from congressional races. Oftentimes we think of them as similar. They're both races for legislative representation and so on. But the percentage of congressional races that don't feature two major party candidates is very low. Right. At the state legislative level, we're talking about between 35 and 40% of seats that feature only one major party candidate. And from a democracy standpoint, that's a very significant thing. You can't have a vital state level democracy if you're not giving voters a choice between at least two candidates. Democracy necessarily entails choice. And in a lot of states, voters don't have that choice. But of course, the lack of state legislative contest, or the extent of state legislative contestation, varies a lot across states. And historically, southern states were far and away, or exhibited far and away the highest levels of non-contestation. The percentage of state legislative elections in the South that didn't feature two major party candidates was always much higher than in other parts of the country. But what really interested me about that, again, going back to my interest in partisan change, is that if you go back to the 70s and 80s, again, southern states had very high non-contestation rates, but the vast bulk of uncontested seats were uncontested by Republicans, right? Fast forward to like the late 90s and 2000s, by then, the majority of uncontested seats in southern state legislative elections were uncontested by Democrats, although there were still some uncontested by Republicans, like in, majority-minority districts.
Right.
So this was, to me, like a kind of a really interesting transformation, because the dominant view in political science, if you read the classic books like the Rise of Southern Republicans or the Two-Party South, was that the South switched from being an uncompetitive part of the country where the Democrats ruled the roost to a part of the country where there was genuine two-party competition. But at the state legislative level, that was not true at all. I mean, it basically shifted from non-competition with one party overwhelmingly dominant to non-competition with the other party overwhelmingly dominant, right? And so it was kind of a very curious transition, which you really don't see. You really don't see a parallel to really anywhere in the country. So I wanted to understand that better, and what I basically argue is that the lack of contestation in state legislative elections in the South in the 1980s is different from the lack of non-contestation in state legislative elections in the South, say in the 2010s, largely because of its source, right? In the 1980s, it was all about the incumbency advantage, right? All of these districts in rural parts of Georgia or Alabama or Mississippi or South Carolina that were voting heavily Republican in presidential elections didn't feature Republican state legislative candidates, largely because Republicans just didn't see the value. Would-be Republican candidates just didn't see the value of running in those districts, right? We're talking about states that were still controlled by Democrats, with long-standing state legislative incumbents who are well known in their districts, and had a lot of friends and neighbors who supported them. There was just no real incentive at that point for Republicans in these southern states to run.
And these were rarely flaming liberals.
Right. 100%.
Especially in the rural small town areas.
Yes. Again, that's all true. It is also true that the Republicans who eventually replaced these folks were a lot more conservative but very true. But then, whereas the lack of contestation in southern state legislative elections today is more a function of the fact that the districts are unwinnable for one party or the other in terms of partisanship, right? In other words, there's now an alignment between the presidential voting and state legislative representation, right? Rock-ribbed Republican districts are never going vote the same way for president and for state senator, and there's no way that a Democrat can win them, and vice versa with rock-ribbed Democratic districts. So once again, you see kind of the nationalization of southern politics at work here.
Well, what I usually ask is the South still exceptional? Because we talk about how Key and C. Van Woodward, and there's just so much ink spilled talking about how the South is exceptional and how it isn't exceptional. But something you mentioned earlier leads me to believe that obviously this isn't necessarily exceptional. It may be accentuated in the South.
Yes.
And the impact more meaningful, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. But where can we see these trends developing elsewhere? In those areas that we discussed earlier, Rhode Island, Maine, Ohio, Illinois, places like that.
Well, listen, Rhode Island, for example, in a weird sort of way, really does resemble the way the South once was, because this is a state in which the Republican Party is virtually non-existent, right? We're talking about 6 out of 38 state senators, and I think 10 out of 75 state representatives are Republicans. So, they are essentially a non-entity in the legislature. The rate of non-contestation in state legislative elections here is at this point actually higher than what it historically was. Well, not higher than what it was in states like Georgia or South Carolina, but it's near where those states were, right? We're talking about 2/3 of legislative districts in this state have no Republican candidates in the general election. If you look at governor's races or congressional races, Republicans don't stand a chance. Actually here in Rhode Island, it's what to do about the lack of electoral competition in general elections is a real issue. There's all these reform proposals out there right now. One thing that a lot of people here are talking about is adopting the California jungle primary model, in which candidates from all parties run against each other in an initial election rather than having party primaries. And the idea there is that with that kind of framework would lead to competitive general elections, but those general elections would probably feature 2 Democratic candidates, right? So it wouldn't increase party competition, but it would, in theory, increase electoral competition absent,
just moves it out of the Democratic primary and into the general.
That's the real issue. Just like in the South 100 years ago, all of the electoral competition in Rhode Island occurs in Democratic primaries. It's really rather remarkable. But I'm a parties person. I believe in strong parties, and so for me,
this must be a hard time for you.
It definitely is, and it's very frustrating that all of these reform proposals emanating out of the electoral reform community, they all sort of assume that parties, it's either they assume that parties should be further weakened, or that it's okay for us to have weak parties, so that we can have a vital democracy without strong parties, right? And I would like to see that core assumption challenged. It's really hard because this kind of anti-party mentality is so deep within American political culture. Like, any reform to strengthen political parties draws like this kind of immediate visceral resistance.
You must love Tammany Hall. Or something,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know about the corruption, but I love the idea.
But that's the connotation when we're talking about strengthening parties, are the machines.
Unfortunately, it is. That's the first thing people say, to me. What? So you want us to go back to the days of smoke-filled rooms, And the truth is, I don't know about the smoke-filled part, but
It'd be vape-filled rooms.
Vape-filled, yeah, right. Whatever it would be, in some ways I think our system was healthier when the parties had more control over who they nominated for office. But anyway, we're getting a little far afield here. What I've been saying, so I have I've been called upon to testify or to give a presentation to a state legislative commission that's looking at electoral reform proposals, and I laid out all the different options: ranked choice voting,
sure,
the jungle primary, and so on. But I've also sort of tried to impart to the powers that be, to the extent that I can, that what a state like Rhode Island actually might really benefit from is changes to ballot access laws, and that would allow new parties to form here, because the fundamental problem here, which again in a weird sort of way is similar to the fundamental problem that exists in a lot of southern states 100 years ago, absent the whole voter disenfranchisement stuff, is that there's a Democratic Party in the state that is dominant, but if you actually look closely at it, it really should be 2 or 3 different parties, right? There's kind of, here in Rhode Island, just like in the South 100 years ago, there's a conservative wing of the Democratic Party, right? There's a lot of sort of pro-life, social conservative Democrats in Rhode Island,
So would this be like rural eastern part of the state?
Not so much that part of the state, but this is a very Catholic state. It's
Sure.
actually the most Catholic state in the country.
I did not know that.
Yeah, and I mean, this
how appropriate that we're at Providence College.
Exactly, a lot of the kind of more working class suburbs of Providence, places like Johnston and Smithfield and North Providence, they feature a lot of ancestrally Democratic and yet socially conservative Italian Catholic or Portuguese Catholic voters, folks that in many cases voted for Trump in 2016, that are not nearly as conservative as it's hard to even think of the institutional Republican Party anymore, but whatever the Republican Party was before Trump took it over, because it's hard to define the Republican Party right now.
Hey, I wrote a dissertation on it, and I'm not even sure how to do that anymore.
Yeah, but sort of working class social conservatives who maybe are leery of what the Republican Party's economic agenda used to be.
Right.
That demographic is very, very common in Rhode Island.
Lots of union members.
Lots of union members and stuff like that, right? Yeah. So there's that segment of the Democratic Party here, and then there's another segment which is, your kind of garden variety urban liberals, and there's also a very active sort of left community here, full of left-wing activist groups.
The DSA.
The DSA, folks, like there's a lot of academic institutions in this state, and so that sort of is part of what sort of facilitates that community. And this is also a very racially diverse state. There's a big Latino community here, and so there's different very distinct subgroups that make up the Democratic Party here, and they don't see eye to eye on a lot. And I think the political system here would actually make a lot more sense and would function a lot better if each of these subgroups, maybe not each of them, but maybe at least, the two dominant parts of the Democratic Party in Rhode Island could break off and form their own political parties, right? Or at least if the left in Rhode Island could break off and form its own political party, let's say a progressive party, right? Because, as I said, there's no competition in most general elections in Rhode Island, right? All the competition occurs in the Democratic primaries where the turnout is so low. It would actually be much healthier for democracy if that competition were moved to the general election, right? I mean, ideally, or I guess the simplest way to do it would be via the Republican Party becoming more, gaining greater strength here, but there's just no, given the Republican Party's national national image, there's no chance that it could really take off in Rhode Island. So let's have competition between a Democratic Party and a Progressive Party. And then the Republican Party, in the places where it can also play a role.
Sure.
Right? I just think that sort of allowing the changing sort of attitudes and sort of social cleavages within Rhode Island to be reflected in the party system,
right, would
be very healthy.
So, hearing you say that, it almost reminds me of how New York in the especially the 60s and 70s, where you had obviously the Democratic and Republican parties, where the vast majority of action took place.
Yeah.
But also you had the Liberal Party,
yep,
the Conservative Party. Thinking about Jim Buckley,
right,
and later on the Working Families Party,
yep,
where you have these sort of cross-listed candidates.
Exactly.
But it doesn't have to be that way.
It doesn't have to be that way. Listen, I think that
Right.
would be an improvement too. I mean, I think New York's fusion law that allows candidates to run under the party affiliation of more than one party.
And it creates really good statistics for political scientists
Oh
and
yeah,
historians.
for us,
It's like, why would you choose to vote on the Liberal ticket as opposed to the Democratic Party
That's right.
ticket, right?
Totally. For us, it's a gold mine. But I realize that most of the world doesn't, nor should it, care about our needs, but for our interests. But I think just as a general matter, for the political system here and in other states too, and maybe in the entire country, it would move us away from binary thinking, right? If voters across the country had to contend with more than two party labels on the ballot, it would, to use my friend Colin King, who you just met, he's a philosopher who's very interested in these sort of electoral reform issues, and what he would say is it would change voters' cognitive architecture, right? And I think there's something to that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was at a symposium in D.C. With some former members of Congress, and it was talking about how we sort of grapple with the democratic system as it is, especially post 2020, or even post 2016. And what I pitched, half tongue in cheek, was that especially in terms of Congress and how Congress does seem to be broken. At least the House of Representatives has really gone above and beyond to seem more dysfunctional than the Senate.
Yep.
Which is really, really something. And what I pitched was, well, why don't we just move to a parliamentary system where we, if this isn't working, you dissolve it, you call a snap election, and give folks the choice to rather than locking dysfunction in for 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, whatever it may be.
So I'm glad you said that. So I actually wrote an article. I didn't publish this article in like an academic journal. I just published it on my Medium page. I tried shopping it around to different sort of non-academic outlets, but I didn't get any takers. So I just decided to put it online. And in this article, I make the case that I think transforming Congress into a multi-party system is dangerous because of precisely that reason. We don't have a parliamentary system, right? We have an overcomplicated multi-party. We have an overcomplicated presidential system, and imposing multi-partyism on top of that would, I worry, gum up the works even more than the works are gummed up now, right? I mean, it's very hard to imagine, a multi-party House working alongside a Senate that, because, it would be very hard to get a multi-party Senate.
An extremely undemocratic. Right.
Because Senate elections have to be single-member elections, which means that, like only two parties are really ever able to compete in them. And then, of course, you have the presidency, which Congress, meaning both the House and Senate, have to work with. And, if you look abroad and you look at examples of multi-party presidentialism, it does work, but it tends to work in countries where the president is super strong, right? Like Brazil or
France.
Or other.
I don't know if we point to France.
Well, France is semi-president, but a lot of the Latin American countries, right? Mm-hmm. Because in those countries, presidents can use, for example, their power over the budget, or their power to initiate legislation to try to kind of put together coalitions to pass his agenda.
It's like the strong governors model in
the
States.
The strong
like Georgia.
Exactly. Yeah. And in fact, so I was going to get to that. Yeah. I think that multi-party presidentialism or governorism could work at the state level, because a lot of governors are institutionally more powerful than the U.S. president is.
Right.
But I think at the federal level, the president institutionally even is relatively weak. I mean, presidential power has grown over time, but just in terms of the tools he has, they're a lot less than what exists in a lot of other institutional contexts. And so I worry that multi-party presidentialism could not work at the American national level, but I think it would be useful for states to experiment with it, and so, let's have states change their ballot access laws and to allow more parties to form, or at least parties to form more easily. Let's have states experiment with proportional representation for state legislative elections, and let's see what happens, and if it works in Rhode Island, perhaps. I mean, we almost never innovate here, but it could potentially solve a lot. I mean, it's hard to. I mean, American politics seems so screwed up right now that it's hard for me to imagine any one reform really solving our problems. But multi-partyism should, I think, be part of the mix.
Well, yeah. So I was thinking about, it's also going to require, obviously, if we were going to do it at the national level, that the Senate would have to be defanged, much in the way the House of Lords was in the
and that's almost impossible.
Think about liberal England and then I guess culminating with Tony Blair in the late 90s, which the constitutional process to do that is.
It's impossible.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, why these reforms nationally, they're
sort of DOA, right?
They seem totally pie in the sky.
Yeah.
Because the U.S. Constitution is so freaking hard to change.
Yeah.
And in fact, it's impossible to change, according to the Constitution's text, the Article 5, it's impossible to change the equal representation for states in the Senate rule. But state constitutions are not that hard to change. Right. We change them all the time. And so I think a lot of these kind of, a lot of the people out there who are thinking about electoral reform and institutional reform, I just think it would make so much more sense to focus on the states. I guess that's my own personal bias as a state politics scholar. But
well, thinking about the states in the South and how politics has developed, especially post 2016, and to the future. Were you surprised at how and why Georgia has become sort of that key state
Yeah.
in the South. It used to be when I was growing up, when we were growing up, it's Florida, Florida,
Yep.
Florida. Where now,
And even North Carolina. more recently.
right?
Nobody-
2008.
As of 10 years ago, maybe not 10 years ago, 12 years ago, nobody predicted Georgia was going to be the next southern state to flip.
No. So you're right, because it was all Florida. It was North Carolina with Barack Obama. Of course, Barack Obama also flipped Indiana.
Right.
So yeah.
Good point.
Neither here nor there. But the competition was in Florida.
Right.
The hopes for Democrats were in Texas,
Right.
because of the Latino population, and Georgia, like you said,
Was not on the radar screen.
What changed in Georgia and maybe alternatively Florida, which I would be very surprised if Democrats contested that nearly as strongly as they have in the past.
Right.
In 2024.
Right.
This year, geez.
Yeah. I think Florida is a bit easier to explain. It clearly has something to do with changing partisan trends among Latinos in Miami, especially Cuban Americans, who seem to be moving away from their ancestral Republican affiliation throughout much of the aughts and early 2010s, but more recently have returned to the Republican fold.
Mm-hmm. We could spend days discussing or spitballing why that is.
Yes, exactly. We could. But the Georgia thing is interesting.
Yeah.
I don't really know why nobody prior to 2020, 2016 maybe was really all that focused on Georgia, or at least it didn't seem like, and of course I went to graduate school in Texas, and Democrats in Texas have forever been talking about how the next election is always the one where Democrats are going to finally break through in Texas, but they never managed to do it.
They're the Brooklyn Dodgers of politics.
That's right. That's exactly right. So, why the initial focus on Texas or North Carolina and not Georgia? That's a bit of a mystery to me. I never really understood it. I don't know if you have any ideas.
No, it's when I started working on my dissertation on the Georgia Republican Party. This would have been 2009. This is when I really started thinking, okay, this will be a dissertation.
Yeah.
And that was before 2010. There were still statewide Democratic elected row officers, Attorney General, Labor Commissioner.
Right.
There were still statewide elected Democrats. That changed when I was really researching and writing in the 2010s. And nobody, it was just, a boring topic. Nobody ever wanted to talk about, oh, you're working on Georgia politics. And it was like, oh, that's not very interesting.
I think it might have something to do with the fact that, again, the Republican ascendancy in North Carolina, but certainly in North Carolina, but also in Texas, occurred earlier than it did in Georgia, right? I mean, as we discussed, Republicans didn't win the Georgia governorship until 2002,
right?
And they didn't win the state legislature or either house of the state legislature.
Well, party switchers helped them in 2002,
oh, right, okay.
And then 2004 is when they took the house. But of course, to do that, you had to overcome lots of partisan gerrymandering,
right,
on the part of the Democratic Party, of Georgia.
So so there was that, and also Clinton won Georgia in I think both 92 and 96, right?
92, not 96.
Right. Okay. So perhaps the sense among a lot of national political analysts was that Georgia, and Georgia's a deep South state.
That's right. That's right.
So I mean, even though it's not, so it's not. In a lot of ways, it can't be compared to Alabama or Mississippi. But I think in a lot of people,
we have Atlanta.
Right, exactly, because of Atlanta. But in a lot of people's minds, it's among that cluster of states that sort of more that realigned more recently, and that therefore was more likely to be in the Republican camp.
Right, it was going to lag because it lagged on the front end. It would lag on the back.
Right.
Not so much.
Not so much, right? But I think people were. So that's the thing. You can't. When kind of analyzing this stuff, you can't just look at the historical patterns. You have to also look at the changing demographics. I think people were kind of missing that, right? You know, I'm not sure why, but I think the demographic changes in Georgia have been just absolutely massive.
Oh yeah, yeah. The population shifts there. Growing up in Illinois, which is a shrinking state, much of New England is a shrinking.
Right.
There was some conversation if Rhode Island was going to lose its second, congressional district in the last census, which would have, to a state like Georgia, Florida, Texas. Some of the western states that are growing by leaps and bounds, and seeing how those changes have shifted politics and the changes in Georgia, which economic development there is sacrosanct, right? Which is something of a through line even from the Democratic governors through Sonny Perdue, Nathan Deal, Brian Kemp, is that jobs, economic development, that's the guiding principle, rather than some of the culture wars that have really eaten into the Republican Party in other places in the South. But of course, the demographic changes wrought by that are often countervailing to their political party. In places like Georgia, the film industry.
Oh, 100%.
Let's bring a lot of union employees from California and New York to Georgia.
Well, if you do that, then there's going to be political consequences.
Right.
I mean, so that's an interesting. Although, Texas has obviously marketed itself as a locational alternative for the California tech industry.
Right.
And for other creative.
The first thing you see when you land at Bergstrom is the Tesla plant.
Exactly.
Right there.
Exactly. But the growth of tech and other formerly California-based industries in Texas hasn't yet led to major political changes. We'll see if Colin Allred can oust Ted Cruz. Right.
But again, that may say more about Ted Cruz than it does about the state of Texas politics.
It well could.
Well, the sort of elephant in the room that we've mentioned briefly is sort of Donald Trump. And going all the way back to when we were talking about at the very beginning about realignment theory, and Vioki has this theory of secular and critical realignments, and that in a previous generation we would be looking at Donald Trump as something of a critical realigning period, even though we're more polarized now and it's very even. The way the political geography has realigned in ways that weren't even present when Barack Obama was running for president, or John Kerry or Al Gore. You were talking about the 2000 election. Go look at the 2000 map from Florida. And you'll scratch your head and say, this is not the same thing here. How what has been Donald Trump's impact on that political geography, and why him, and why did it take so long? That's a whole book.
I'll say a couple of things.
Answer everything. Discuss.
It's a very complicated, nuanced thing, because on the one hand, you could say, and I always do say to my students, that to me, the most interesting thing about the 2016 presidential election was how, despite the fact that we had these two highly unusual presidential candidates, right, the first female major party presidential candidate in Hillary Clinton on the one hand, and Donald Trump on the other hand, despite that fact, if you actually look at the individual level voting patterns, they're remarkably similar to what they were in 2012. In other words, 92% of us voted the same way in 2016 as we did in 2012. And the reason that Donald Trump won in 2016 while Barack Obama won in 2012 had everything to do right, with a small shift among a fairly small number of voters in a small number of states, right? And actually that shift that proved consequential in 2016 was not in the South, right? It was among the white working class in the North. It was among, rural Wisconsinites and rural Michiganders, right? And working class whites in those states, right? Who, had stuck with Barack Obama in 2008 and 2012.
Right.
But then they were
Iowa, too.
Yeah. And so actually what's interesting about that, and I think, this is a kind of a more, this is a topic that gets us a little bit away from Southern politics, but not entirely, is the fact that, in the mid-aughts, there was this whole debate that started off in the mainstream media, or in the mainstream political analysis community, I guess, the non-academic political analysis community, and then made its way to political science about the quote-unquote white working class, and how did Democrats lose the white working class. And there was this famous book by Thomas Frank called What's the Matter with Kansas, in which he argued that, Republicans had successfully duped the white working class into voting against its economic interests by focusing on social issues. And Larry Bartels, who's a very prominent political scientist at Vanderbilt, wrote this article called What's the Matter with Kansas, in which he basically showed that...
You're taking me back to my junior year of college.
Right. Oh, good. So I'm glad you remember all this.
Oh, yes.
Bartels, in that article, he argues that there really, and this was like circa 2006, right?
Yep.
There really wasn't a shift to the Republicans among the white working class outside the South, right? At least if you define the white working class as white people in the bottom third of the income distribution, right? White working class people defined that way in the non-South were still, on average, far more likely to vote Democratic than Republican. That was Bartels' argument. So he said that Thomas's view that the white working class had left the Democrats, at least outside the South, just had no empirical validity to it. But by 2016, this is no longer the case, right? In 2016, we see very clearly that the white working class, not just in the South, but also in the non-South, has moved into the Republican camp. And that is a significant and important shift, which has had and will continue to have major consequences for American politics. And of course, as you alluded to, the flip side of that shift is the movement to the Democrats on the part of the well-educated professional class, which we can also trace over time.
Right.
And you can see these kind of surges in different elections, like 2008, but clearly in the Trump era, right? That community, that social group has consolidated itself within the ranks of the Democratic Party. And so whereas this notion that the traditional class divide had become inverted, which was sort of what Tom Frank was hinting at circa 2004, whenever it was that he wrote that book, that back then was just not really borne out by the empirical data. Now I think, at least among the white population, we can kind of say that. I mean, it's still a little tricky. There's still a lot of wealthy people who vote Republican and support Republicans,
Sure.
But certainly if you look at the other marker of class besides income, which is educational attainment, if you focus on that, right, and you compare college graduates to non-college graduates, or,
men versus women.
Well, so if you add gender to it, then it becomes even more clear, right?
Right.
But yeah, so if you focus on educational attainment, among white people, the divide is crystal clear now, and even among people of color, we're starting to see a growing role of educational attainment. And that's interesting, right? There's no obvious parallel to that in American history. You know,
Right.
a party system in which educational attainment is the primary.
Right, since public education really only dates to the progressive era.
Exactly. Like the primary demographic divider.
Yeah.
You know, like this is highly unusual. But as folks like Thomas Piketty argue, this is not just an American thing. You can see this in Western democracies across the globe.
Yep.
So clearly,
Post-Brexit Britain
Yes,
is a
exactly.
crystal clear example of this.
Exactly. So we're not the only ones that are contending with these sorts of divides.
Right. Well, going back to that issue of the suburbs, for Tom Frank, the rock rib Republican suburb was Overland Park,
Yes.
which is now Sharice Davids.
Right.
This is Democratic territory.
Right.
Atlanta,
Yep.
the donut around Atlanta was that's what fueled Republicans to the statewide wins. That was the Newt Gingrich territory.
Yeah.
But like you said, even within going back to political geography, if you just look at the county, for example, you'll see a blue county. If you look at the town, you'll see a blue town. But if you get in there
Yes.
and look at the difference between the inner suburbs versus the outer suburbs, the Forsyth counties versus the Cobb counties, or in Atlanta, if you look at Buckhead, you have to get down to the street level and you see the West Paces and Tuxedo Road, where the really wealthy people live. Those are still red districts.
Right.
So that
There's all these layers
Right.
and intricacies.
Right.
But at core, I think what this kind of points to is, getting back to Southern politics versus New England politics.
Yeah.
These sort of micro level geographical divisions, they more or less exist everywhere across the country. Right? And so this is sort of, in my view, one of the big conundrums. Is it conundrums or conundra? I don't know.
Feels like it should be the latter.
Okay.
But
so I'll say conundra.
There you go.
This is
Say
one-
it with confidence and nobody will question
That's
you.
right. Okay, conundra. This is one of the big conundra of modern American politics, right? We have a political system that is organized around macro-regional difference, right? Organized by state, and states kind of group themselves into regions. And historically, at the national level, political geography did express itself regionally, right? But today, in America, the importance of geography is not at the regional level as much as at the kind of the micro level, right? In other words, micro geographical cleavages, right? In other words, differences between inner city and inner suburb and exurb and rural area, right? Those are the important differences, not so much north versus south or south versus Midwest or West or whatever. And so this is and again, this is reflective of the broader nationalization of American politics, right? In a nationalized polity, right, geography will express itself, in terms of micro cleavages rather than macro ones. But what does that mean for how we should organize our politics? I'm thinking a lot about this as a federalism scholar, right? Because federalism, the main justification for federalism, at least state-based federalism, is that states kind of are discrete political communities. That New York is fundamentally different from Georgia, is fundamentally different from Minnesota, is fundamentally different from California, and so we need to give states the authority to govern themselves, because what works in one state won't work in another. But if the central geographical divisions are not state to state, but rather county to county or neighborhood to neighborhood, right? And if those basic geographical divisions express themselves roughly the same way, whether we're talking about Georgia or Minnesota or California, then it's hard to justify a kind of state-based federalism, right? And so I'm thinking about this a lot. Like, what is, how are we supposed to make a federal system work in this kind of modern context? It's a really complicated question.
When you're saying this, all I can see sort of emerging in my mind's eye is sort of a return to sort of the old Holy Roman Empire.
Yeah, right. Because it gave a
which
lot
is
of...
hardly the poster child for functional government, but it sort of
gave
gets
that kind
to
of
what
ultra local autonomy.
Right. You're talking city states. You're
Right.
talking about these confederations of, we'll say wheat producing area or pork producing
Right.
Rural areas, and it's again not based on states, not based necessarily even on counties, but it's based on the socioeconomic demographics of those areas.
That's exactly right. So yes, I agree that's not exactly the model we're looking for, but something sort of
plug that
this.
into an AI generator and see what the map looks like.
Yes.
But it's sort of a Hanseatic league.
Right. Something like that. Yeah.
Right. But no, I mean, it's a really interesting question to ponder is, and especially in a post-Dobbs
Yeah. Right. For sure.
Country.
I mean, it really doesn't make sense if you think about that issue. To have, if you're going to make the argument that Dobbs returns the issue of abortion to the states, right? But like, in this day and age, what is really a state? I mean, is there a Georgia political community that can act coherently? There isn't, right? There's the Metro Atlanta isn't even a coherent political community, right? There's massive differences between outer Cobb County and Fulton, whatever, and so like if we're actually going to think about the issue of abortion in terms of local democracy, local democratic choice, it doesn't really make sense to me to think about that at the state level, just because states are such bizarre agglomerations of different local geographies and local communities. But I guess we have to work with what we have. So
right. As if amending the Constitution to change the Senate wasn't pie in the sky enough. It's like, well, this whole state thing.
Yeah, let's redraw the states. Yeah, not going to happen.
Well, just as we wrap up, you're somebody who's been called on to offer analysis for elections, and I'm not going to put you on the spot and ask you to make any predictions, but has it gotten harder as an election analyst?
Definitely. Because the truth of the matter is, as the polling industry is experiencing just a major crisis right now.
Yeah.
They don't know what the hell they're doing, and I think they'll largely admit it. I used to be in the poll.
I thought you were going to give me a Nate Silver-esque talking to that. I just don't understand the polls or probability.
No, one thing I didn't mention was that I worked in the polling world for a little bit.
Okay.
In 2012,
you know of which you speak.
Yeah, well, to some degree. I took a break from graduate school in 2012 to work for YouGov, the online pollster in California. And so I have a pretty good idea, I think, of the challenges that pollsters face, and I think that none of the strategies that they've come up with to deal with the most fundamental issue, which is that there's just no way to draw anything that looks like a random sample anymore.
Right.
Because, we don't have landline phones anymore, and
I don't answer in a phone number.
Right,
I don't
exactly.
know.
Response rates are down to 7%, maybe even lower than that. At this point.
It's like 7. That's
And so, why in the world would we assume that the 5% or whatever it is of people who answer the phone and take these surveys are representative of the other 95%?
Right.
Right.
That's
So there's these massive issues, and nobody has really figured out a way to address them that I find compelling. But at the end of the day, our predictive ability in political science is largely based on those polls, right? The other thing that political scientists do besides look at polls or aggregate polls is develop these forecasting models based on economic conditions.
Right.
But that's increasingly becoming difficult to do as well, because as I'm sure there's all this evidence that economic conditions are increasingly being decoupled from political assessments.
Right.
I mean, right now the economy is doing relatively well.
By every metric.
Yeah,
Right.
and yet voters are not rewarding President Biden
The
for it at
vibes
all.
economy.
Yeah, the vibe. So if we're no longer, I mean, we can't use either polls or objective economic indicators to predict elections anymore. That makes our job as political scientists who are supposed to predict almost impossible, which is why I am increasingly avoiding all.
This is why I'm thankful I'm a historian.
Yeah.
I can dip a toe if I want to, but at the end of the day, I need some dead people's mail to read.
There you go.
But no, I think that's a really good point, and I think we see this in really, again, post Dobbs elections, and how if you watch 24-hour news or even read mainstream media, ostensibly nonpartisan media, Democrats were headed for a wipeout in 2022. This past election cycle, Democrats overperformed in practically every metric too. But it just doesn't. It's hard to wrap our heads around expectations based on prior results,
especially because the turnout is fluctuating so much, not in the aggregate, but in terms of the social groups that are turning out. And this is,
remember, all 4 elections were supposed to be Republican,
right?
That is just not that.
And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the Democratic Party is increasingly a higher SES, party.
Right.
So there's all these things that are in the mix right now. It could just be that we're in a moment of instability where it's just going to take some time for the new normal to emerge, and then we'll be able to start predicting again. But to be honest, I don't think that's what's going on. And the fundamental, again, this points to another problem with just the polling, which there's really, no way to address it that I can see. Unlike other forms of survey research, you're really pollsters, when they ask horse race questions, right, and when they're trying to, estimate election or predict election results based on those horse race questions, what they're actually doing is they are sort of they're trying to measure the opinions of a population that doesn't exist yet. The election hasn't happened yet. You don't know what the population is that you're trying to model. You're having to sort of guess what that population will be. And I think it used to be easier to do that when we had fairly common and fairly reliable expectations about turnout. But now with all these fluctuations, it's, I think, really hard.
I think something more at a more meta level is, people like us who cover politics or study politics. Our expectation is for the public that also think like us.
Yeah.
And we're sort of ascribing our expectations for how much they know, how much they follow the news, how much they know about this candidate's positions now versus what it was then, and that's always been the case, but it seems more accentuated now.
Yeah, I mean, in political, it's a little tricky. I was always taught in graduate school, when I started working on public opinion and surveys and so forth, to be very careful about that. But having said that, the divide between the political professional class, both the academic class and just people who actually work in politics, and the ordinary American electorate is probably greater now than it was 10, 15 years ago. So.
I think that's a much better way of saying it than I did. But last question. Tell me about what projects you're working on right now.
So I am currently finishing a book, which I'm about ready to send to Oxford University Press. Hopefully they'll
Congratulations.
take it. Well, we'll see. I mean, congratulate me after I've signed a book contract.
Will do.
This has been a project that I've been working on for about 7 years. So right around the time I finished those articles on Southern politics, I decided to turn my attention to a book project. And this is a kind of a different topic, although it's got a bit of it is a different topic, but it's got some common points. The book really focuses on the evolution of American fiscal federalism. So the relationship between the national government and the states in the areas of taxing and spending, especially taxing, from the 1930s to today. And I got into this topic because I initially was really interested in what was going on in state capitals during the 1930s, during the Great Depression. Yeah. I had a really good sense of what was going on in Washington, D.C. during the Great Depression, the New Deal, FDR, and so on. But I just sort of figured there must have been big transformations at the state level in the 1930s, but I never read about them.
Right.
So I started exploring that topic, and what I discovered, and this is something I knew nothing about, was that by far the big issue in state capitals in the middle of the 1930s was taxation. Suddenly, for the first time in American history, state governments had to raise revenue, right? This is something that nobody really thinks about. The dominant view is that, in the 19th century, the states were strong and the national government was weak, right? And that all flipped in the 1930s and the 1960s, and the national government kind of superseded the states. That's actually not exactly accurate. The states did very little that required raising revenue before the 1930s, right? They were primarily responsible for criminal justice and morality policy, and neither of those areas required a lot of money. If anything, local governments were the most important fiscal agents.
Ad valorem taxes.
Exactly. Yeah, very good.
The car tag.
Yes, property taxes. That's right. And the national government had to raise a lot of money whenever it fought a war, right? Otherwise, it was not so important. But you had this kind of strange, it's almost the inversion of what we have today. Local governments were dominant fiscally, followed by the national government periodically, intermittently, whenever there was a big foreign policy crisis. And states, from a fiscal perspective, were almost irrelevant. In the 1930s, for the first time in, over a century, but arguably since the beginning of the Republic, states suddenly have to raise a lot of money because, A, the national government is calling upon them to finance poor relief. B, they're in the process of taking over school systems from local governments. And just a number of other things.
Schools and roads.
Yes, exactly. So this is a real crisis for state governments. They have to figure out how to raise revenue all at once. And so states make decisions kind of, actually in some ways things haven't really changed all that much, in kind of an off-the-cuff manner without much thinking. Some states adopt income taxes, other states adopt sales taxes. Other states adopt both, and so we get this patchwork.
Hi, it's Georgia. We're both.
Yeah, right, right. But we get this patchwork quilt of taxation systems. Yep. And so my book explores from that point forward how state taxation policy has evolved, and alongside it, how there's this kind of coterminous national debate over fiscal federalism. So as states develop different tax systems, there's kind of a movement that emerges in 1930s era DC to coordinate national and state taxation, so that A, tax competition between states is ameliorated, right? There's this concern that if we have the states taxing different ways, then they're going to undersupply public goods because businesses are going to flee from high tax states to low tax states. Something I'm sure you know about all about this, being in the South and in Georgia.
The Sun Belt Revolution.
Yes, exactly. And so all of this sort of ends up. It takes a long time. In the 1960s, Congress passes a big law called revenue sharing, which is an effort at its core to reduce interstate tax competition and to ensure that all states are roughly on the same playing field fiscally. but then that gives way to like devolution in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan, where there's an effort to kind of give the states their fiscal powers back, but it's kind of not really genuine.
Yeah, the block granting.
Granting and all of that. But the real goal, of course, is to shrink government at all levels. It's not like Reagan wanted strong government at the state level and alongside weak government at the federal level. The idea was you give the states these powers, but because they're going to be in competition with each other, they're not going to be able to establish really robust welfare states or anything like that. Then I take it all the way to the 21st century, where I talk about the red-blue divide in taxation that's emerged in the 21st century, where red states are constantly cutting income taxes, and blue states are kind of more tepidly raising them, and what this means, how the growth of partisan polarization has impacted state fiscal policy, and what this means for fiscal federalism going forward. So that's kind of,
interesting,
in a nutshell, the scope of the book.
As exciting as any book on taxation could be, yours sounds the most. But no, it's really interesting, because I was just talking to a colleague who's from Kansas, actually.
Oh yeah.
And she grew up. She was in junior high school. She's our first Gen Z colleague at the library when Sam Brownback was governor.
Yep.
And the fiscal crisis that unfolded in Kansas, for a number of reasons, but primarily because of the tax regime, and spending regime that the Brownback administration sort of put onto Kansas as if it were Texas.
Exactly. So this is my last chapter. That's exactly right. So my last chapter of the book talks all about kind of the emergence of all this rhetoric about the quote-unquote Texas model, which was very prominent right around the time Brownback became governor, and it was especially prominent when Rick Perry was running for president in 2012. And there's something, economists debate endlessly. Texas did have spectacular economic growth in the aftermath of the Great Recession, and there's a debate about exactly what caused that. But of course, Perry argued that it was the Texas low taxes, low services model, which Brownback tried to emulate in Kansas with, shall we say, less than successful results, right? So my book sort of goes into how this tax policy, which I agree doesn't initially sound interesting, but I'm trying to make the case that it's actually a lot more interesting than it actually initially sounds.
I think it's extremely interesting, especially from a historical point of view. In Georgia, we have the ad valorem taxes of the 30s, the minimum foundation program, where it's like, oh, you actually want goods and services, you're probably going to have to pay for goods and services.
That's right.
But you're going to do it the most regressive way possible, a sales tax.
Right.
In Georgia, we have these local option sales taxes that fund transportation and education. The Chamber of Commerce taxes, or I say, it's like, you have all these tourists coming into Athens to watch football games. Let them pay for
100%.
And roads. Clearly, it works to a degree, but no, I think it's really interesting, especially that sort of fetishization of other states' tax policies and how it sort of plays out in the. There's probably a good paper to be written here about the sort of intra-party dynamics of taxation, fetishization, of we have to get rid of the income tax, whereas the party establishment, the business establishment, is saying,
right. So certainly,
how are we going to fill that $4 billion hole for public schools?
That's right. And there is so I get into this a little bit in the book about how that is exactly the conflict in a lot of red states between Republican legislators and sort of like more.
If there's a policy dispute, it's usually this one.
Right. The kind of the post 2010 Tea Party Republican legislators who are really focused on tax cuts, income tax cuts, and the old school business community, which wants tax cuts but is more reticent about the speed with which, in some cases,
steady as she goes.
Yeah, exactly. So, that's exactly right.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading it. I'm looking forward to see what you have to say about the South in there. Adam, thank you so much for your time. I took up most of your afternoon.
It was my pleasure.
But this was great. I really do appreciate it, and you'll have to come down to UGA sometime. And,
I will definitely come down.
A standing invitation. I'll even give you the 50-cent tour of the Special Collections Library.
Well, I love visiting archives. So.
Well, boy, have we got you covered then. So, well, thank you very much on behalf of the University of Georgia, Russell Library. Thanks again.
Thank you.